I'm going to begin by asking a direct question about the characteristics of the case, initially a more general one. And then we'll get into the specifics. Can he truly be accused of terrorism, as both the president and the administration have repeatedly stated and emphasized, especially when considering the fact that he could have killed him anywhere, whether it was in his home, in a public place, or at any time of day or night, and taking into account the significant terror, fear, and anxiety he created and spread among people? Or is that
not possible? Theoretically, they can accuse him of whatever they want. The fact is whether they'll actually be able to find him guilty, whether a jury can find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So far, he is only being charged with 3 crimes: aggravated homicide, obstruction or destruction of evidence, and also a type of aggravated battery, which is causing physical harm to another person. These are preliminary charges that are only at the state level in Utah. In the next 3 days, they are going to request what is called an indictment, which is a charge before the grand jury. They have to request this indictment in order to charge him with a crime that carries the death penalty, because in Utah, there is the death penalty. Utah is one of 27 states in our union that has the death penalty, and they are going to charge him with what is called aggravated murder in Utah. And for the crime of aggravated murder to exist in Utah, because remember, in every state, the laws are a bit different. In Utah, it has to be a homicide with a level of premeditation and planning, and the person who commits the homicide must also put other people in danger. In this case, it's clear that if he is guilty of this, he also put other people in danger when he started shooting this rifle with hundreds of people around Charlie Kirk. So it has the elements of
premeditation because he arrived at 11:30, meaning he had time to change his mind.
There is definitely premeditation here. The law regarding premeditation can be, believe it or not, just minutes and sometimes even seconds. It doesn't have to be a plan made a week or even hours in advance. It can be a very short period, but here there is ample evidence that there was premeditation.
In other words, there is premeditation and the possibility of causing harm to third parties.
To third parties as well.
And that would then be an aggravated homicide.
Correct. Under UB law,
is the term assassination not used in North American jurisprudence?
Yes, it's used to refer to murder, and the word murder is used, but not the word assassination itself. The term used is homicide, a premeditated homicide.
Because in Cuban legislation, I remember there was a clear distinction between assassination and homicide, and assassination included premeditation, malice aforethought, nighttime, all those kinds of things. And homicide could be negligent, non-negligent, etc., right? But here, no, here it's
murder, but it's classified by degrees. So there's murder in the 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree. There's manslaughter, which is like a homicide due to negligence. It can be a homicide based on, in English, a crime of passion, a
crime of passion, especially connected to marital issues.
And so on. And that's divided by degrees and has different punishments and different maximum penalties, depending on the state, depending on whether it's state or federal.
In Spanish, the terms culposo and doloso are also used. Jose Antonio was just telling me, all right, so the fact that he ultimately, in practice, turned himself in voluntarily is a mitigating factor.
I would tell you that in this type of case, it won't make a difference. In a case as serious as this, the fact that he turned himself in won't be seen as a reason to reduce the possible sentence. Here, the minimum sentence he can receive is life imprisonment. It will never be reduced below that. So he's facing a minimum sentence of life in prison, with the maximum being the death penalty. And in Utah, the death penalty still exists, but they are very inefficient, very slow. Almost all the people who are on death row have been there for decades in Utah. And just the other day, they almost eliminated the death penalty at the last moment, but they changed their minds and the death penalty still exists in Utah. They have 2 ways of carrying it out. One is lethal injection, or by firing squad, which is called execution by firing squad. Firing squads. That's still in place. I didn't know
that there were still executions by firing squad, but in some places there still are. And the electric chair no longer exists anywhere.
In some places it still exists, but they're not using it. It exists, it's on the books. The option is there, but they're hardly using it. Because
I remember a journalist, Angie Sandoval, if you're watching out there, Greetings, Angie. I don't know if you're still at Telemundo or Univision, but I think she went to see what at that time was possibly the last use of the electric chair.
There were, in fact, many public executions historically that didn't go well, where the person caught on fire, where it took a very long time for them to...
Those memories were very cruel. Smoke came out of their head. Right.
That happened several times. That's why they stopped using it. They started with lethal injections, but had to stop for a while because they couldn't get the necessary chemicals for the formula, since pharmaceutical companies didn't want to sell them to the government. But now they've managed to...
And now, I don't know, we'll see. How many states don't have the death penalty? There are more that don't than those that do.
27 have it and the rest don't, almost always. The more liberal, progressive, democratic states don't have the death penalty. It's more in the right-leaning conservative states. All of them still keep the death penalty.
It's 27 and 23, that's right?
Right?
If my math isn't wrong, 7 and 3, 2 and 2, 4 and 1, 5.
Almost all of Europe doesn't have the death penalty. I think...
All of it, right? Who has the death penalty in Europe? I'm not sure, at least in the European Union. In the European Union, none.
None?
In the European Union. There isn't any? I don't know. Well, then when you look at this case, as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, what do you think is worth highlighting to the public about what happened, right? Beyond the political impact. We'll talk about that
later. Well, it's certainly quite interesting, and I think it's actually a rather big surprise for many people that the accused individual comes from what is basically a middle-class Republican family. This is something that for a lot of observers was not expected at all. That will be interesting for the prosecution because it will be a bit harder for them to prove the motive. The motive. Because it was assumed by many people, I mean, from what I saw on A and on YouTube, many people assumed that the person who was going to commit the homicide, who committed the homicide, was the leftist or the Democrat. There were rumors that maybe it was a trans person, and from what we know now, all of that has changed. They said that there was trans ideology in the bullets.
That was a mistake in the Wall Street Journal.
It turned out to be incorrect. So it's going to be interesting. The prosecution has to prove, of course, that he committed the crime, but they also have to explain to the jury, at least to some extent, why he did it, what was the motive for killing Charlie Kirk. So it's going to be interesting. The evidence seems pretty strong against Tyler Robinson. He already admitted to his father that he did it. He spoke with a pastor where he also confessed. There are videos, photos of him, the identification of his car, the rifle scope, which they say is quite unique, and the bullets. I suppose there will be a lot of DNA evidence as well. They were able to recover evidence from the roof where he was lying down.
The forearm, the palm of the hand when he jumped, the visible shoe prints, the
shoes.
Now, yesterday, getting a bit ahead of myself, and maybe a lot of people didn't understand what you just pointed out, I said, well, tomorrow it could be a member of the Republican Party and not the Democrat. I ventured to say something that, in a way, I still stand by. The political nature of the crime should not be determined by the killer, but rather by the victim. What I mean is, this man did not go to kill. He did not go to kill a democratic leader. And to me, whoever it is truly the nature of the victim that ultimately determines the political character of the act. And later on, we're going to have here two young people who are the same age as this alleged killer. It's important to always use the term alleged, even if it seems obvious, and who have some insights into how young people operate nowadays, and so on. But the reaction that happened, and this is a question I asked myself yesterday as well, from people outside saying, we got him in the neck, that's great, actually celebrating what happened. That's not a crime.
No, it's not a crime. That's protected under the First Amendment right to free speech. It's happened on both sides, Republican sides, Democratic sides, where people have celebrated. The same thing happened, for example, when George Floyd died. There were certain people who celebrated and said things like, he was a criminal anyway, so who cares if the police killed him? And now the same thing is happening with Charlie Kirk, where people are celebrating his death because certain segments of our society think he was racist or whatever. Celebrating in itself is not considered a crime, but those people are still facing consequences because they are being fired from their jobs, and they are also being kicked out of places where they hold memberships. There's an online movement that I've seen on X where all these people who are celebrating are, for example, leaving negative reviews on their businesses, asking the businesses to fire those people from their jobs. It's part of that cancel culture we have now, where if you don't agree with what someone says, they try to hurt you one way or another. So it's not a crime, but that kind of celebration can have other consequences.
Yesterday, I also mentioned that in Europe, first of all, in English, the word apologia doesn't mean the same as in Spanish. In Spanish, apologia means praise or making propaganda in favor of something. No, it doesn't mean apologizing. So in Spain and in Europe in general, a crime is referred to as apología del delito. For example, promoting or advocating for racist or anti-Semitic ideas or similar things. The advocacy or public support of racism is considered a crime, as is calling for, inciting or encouraging assassination, or even celebrating or glorifying this kind of thing. In Europe, that's a crime.
And you're absolutely right. And it's fascinating because I've been studying this recently in England where, for example, England is the basis for much of our legal and judicial system, but you don't have a First Amendment, you don't have the right to say, you don't have free expression. In England, people are being put in jail for what they post on Facebook, for what they post on Instagram. It's incredible. That doesn't happen here. Well, because
England, I don't know. Maybe historians will correct me if I'm wrong, but technically there is no constitution. There's the Magna Carta, which is basically an agreement that was made between the monarchy and the civil government to govern themselves, but I don't think there's a constitution as such. Later I'll have historians here to see if
they correct me. And the Americans wanted to prevent what was happening in England from happening in this country, and that's why they had the foresight to create the Constitution to protect Americans and
to successfully pass the Bill of Rights.
You can get into trouble if you say something calling for violence, making threats, but not just for simply celebrating after the act has already been committed.
Act committed.
Once the act is committed,
and if you inciting
violence can in fact result in you facing criminal consequences depending on the level to which you take it. However, almost always when it comes to the issue of free speech, the court tends to give it a significant amount of leeway, a great deal of freedom, as long as it is considered reasonable, as long as you are not directly calling for someone's death or advocating violence against another person. So celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, even though it is something truly awful, something that common sense and basic ethics say you really should not do, it is nevertheless not illegal.
Now, the big battle in this case is going to be whether or not the death penalty is ultimately obtained by the prosecution. The president, in a very public and highly visible statement, practically called for it. When the head of the executive branch of government gives an opinion like that, does it in any way affect the trial? Does it influence the proceedings, the jury, or the outcome in any significant manner?
Well, first of all, he shouldn't give it. Trump gave it, and the governor did too. They really shouldn't do that, but the
governor of San doesn't
nothing. But as the executive and leader of our state, none of them should do that. Even if there is all this evidence, the accused is still presumed innocent as well. He is
his friend.
He has the right, like any citizen, to be presumed innocent and to have a trial before a jury without any kind of political interference, just as the Department of Justice can investigate this case and can choose to bring charges or not, and handle the case one way or another without political interference and without political pressure. And the same goes for the Utah prosecutor's office. So the president does not have the power to order someone's execution or to prosecute someone. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have that power. That is done by the Department of Justice. I understand that he may be doing it for political reasons, but legally, he does not have that power.
Now, when you read the newspapers these days and you look at the headlines and the stories being reported, you can see that the fight is already underway, and it is happening specifically because of the particular nature and background of the victim involved in this case. In fact, there was already at least one person who publicly stated that J.D. Vance should be sued for allegedly using government resources inappropriately and for putting the body on Air Force One too.
That's not going anywhere. They have the ability as the executive to use the resources they have for whatever reason they want. If that were true, Obama would have been sued when he flew a plane full of cash, I can't remember where it was, to Iran, to try to get some hostages or for the nuclear program. The executive, the president, can use the executive's resources for the reasons they believe are reasonable.
So really, it's just about really wanting to
keep pushing this political and ideological division that we have between the left and the right in our society today. Yes,
Now, as a former prosecutor, what are the chances of getting the death penalty, or let's put it the other way around? If you were this individual's defense attorney, what would you argue in his defense to prevent him from being sentenced to death?
Well, depending on the specific crime or crimes that he is ultimately charged with, you would need to attack or challenge the elements of each individual crime separately and thoroughly. For example, let's proceed as if I were currently defending against the particular charges that he is presently facing. The first thing you do in a case like this is start with a psychological profile. You order evaluations by several psychiatrists and psychologists to determine what led the defendant to this point. Maybe he experienced some kind of eradication or realization. Thank you very much. Maybe it doesn't stem from nothingness, maybe it comes from the internet. They say there came a point when he dropped out of university and he was at his parents' house spending 20 hours a day on the internet. That's what you try to do. You try to argue that he wasn't putting anyone else in danger. He himself was only targeting Charlie Kirk. And the goal is to present as many mitigating factors as possible to try to convince a judge that the death penalty should not apply in this case, that what he should actually receive instead of the death penalty is a life sentence. That's if there is no other defense that can be used at trial in a case like this.
The political impact of this, was quite significant, especially because of how well known he was among young people in general, not just conservatives.
He was very well known among young people. He was famous for his videos on YouTube, on X, on Instagram, and the movement was getting bigger and bigger. Every time he went somewhere, hundreds, even thousands of students would come to hear him. And he is one of the people who was key for Donald Trump. They called him the Trump influencer of the youth. He kind of made it almost cool, almost trendy for young people to be conservative. So the effect on the conservative movement was truly enormous, having a significant and far-reaching impact. Now at this point, they're kind of trying to see who will eventually step up and take his place as the new leader. Ben Tupero, who is another conservative political activist like him, seems to be the one who will take, he says he will take Charlie Kirk's place, going to universities and having these debates with students, which is what made Charlie Kirk famous. He would open up the microphone to anyone who wanted to speak and debate with him, and those videos went viral. They were enormous and had millions and millions of views. So his absence will definitely have an impact, especially on conservative youth.
The political discussion will revolve on one hand around the issue of firearms, which continues to be a major topic of debate due to its implications for public safety and individual rights. On the other hand, the conversation will also center on the diversity present in our society, a factor that brings a wide range of perspectives and often leads to passionate, heated debate. When we consider these two important issues, firearms and diversity, which of them are we going to keep debating forever? Will the arguments about gun control and the challenges of embracing diversity ever truly be resolved? Or will these discussions continue to spark disagreement and debate for years to come? American society is going to become more and more divided. I know these are common points discussed everywhere, but the question is still valid, right?
Yes, it's complicated, and you see it in this situation. You see many people openly celebrating his death, and there are also many who are deeply mourning his death. It's such a deep and fundamental division we have between the left and the right, and there needs to come a point like before when people could simply disagree for the sake of disagreement in a reasonable way, without insults and without violence. The problem is that the internet has amplified the most radical extremes of both the left and the right. That's the reality. And instead of talking face to face, you say things on the internet and post things online that you would never do in person. And that has made certain people more and more radical, which seems to be what happened with this person.
You, who every day, cases come to your office. That political violence is reflected in criminal violence, let's call it that. Do you see more cases every day? Or do I remember you telling me last time that no, that things seemed calmer?
Yes, the number of crimes themselves has actually gone down overall, in fact, over time.
Because that's not the impression we have.
Yes, I know why. Because just imagine we have access to media 24 hours a day, so you're constantly seeing crimes, the most horrible crimes, but it's not necessarily happening here in Miami. You might be seeing a crime in Chicago, a crime in San Francisco, a crime in Mexico, so it gives you the impression that it's one crime after another, 24 hours a day. But locally, here in Miami, crime itself has gone down, the numbers have decreased, but it's that access to information 24 hours a day and to these videos that we didn't have before. When we were kids, there wasn't a Ring camera on every
corner
watching every crime that happens. So it gives the impression that there's more crime and more violence than ever. But even here in Miami, crime rates are lower.
And what is the most common crime? It's still drugs.
It is a combination of drugs, domestic violence, robbery, and property crimes, which are the ones with the highest volume overall.
Home invasion. There's everything.
Everything exists, but because
before you used to see it a lot on TV, but not
as much now. Fewer cases, because what happened with that type of crime is that the laws changed and are super strict. Now it's a crime where you can get jail time. There's a whole
discussion about whether drugs coming from Venezuela, where Venezuelan gangs are involved, have increased in recent years. Is that so?
With drugs themselves, but not at such a particularly high or especially elevated level. There have been Venezuelan gangs and members of Venezuelan gangs who have established themselves here in Miami. I have represented several members, but they don't have the level of sophistication, for example, that the Mexican or Colombian cartels have. So it exists, but not at a high level, which I think is being exaggerated based on the numbers I've seen.
Okay. Jose Antonio told me that you wanted to ask Dr. A about the person who has been accused of killing Trump, Kale. He mentioned that you were interested in learning more about this individual and the circumstances of the accusation. If you have any particular questions or concerns for Dr. A regarding this case, please let me know so I can pass them along as well. The one from Mar-a-Lago who is defending himself and who says that the judge says he's not saying legal things. What would be things that are not legal to say in court?
Well, for example, you have to ask witnesses questions that are directly related to the accusation or to the defendant. They have to be relevant to the crime itself. When a defendant represents himself, judges almost always give them a lot of leeway. They don't make them strictly follow the laws or the rules of evidence. But if it gets to the point where the defendant, in his own defense, starts acting inappropriately, giving speeches, political speeches, the judge stops him immediately. And if he continues with that behavior, the judge makes him sit at the table and lets the two lawyers who are there to help him, lets those lawyers take control of the trial.
When you are assigned a lawyer, a public defender, there are two of them.
In a case as serious as this one?
Yes.
When we're talking about capital cases and life felonies, they almost always assign you two lawyers because it's a complicated case. I'm sure the prosecution will have 6 or 7. So
it's an interesting thing because for people who have immigration issues, and we always recommend here that you seek a lawyer, we don't do it as propaganda. The law requires the government to provide you with a defense attorney in criminal cases, but not in immigration cases. So if you do not bring your own lawyer, the state will not assign you a lawyer to defend you in an immigration case. And that is simply how it is.
And believe it or not, in many cases, even in criminal cases, you don't have the right to a lawyer.
Like that.
People don't understand that.
How is
that? One more thing. You have the right to a criminal defense attorney if the prosecution is asking to put you in jail. If the prosecution is not asking to put you in jail, if it's
fine? No.
No, it can even be a criminal offense. If they're asking you, for example, for a probation term, a fine, a class, therapy, counseling, you don't have the right to an attorney. You have to defend yourself. And even if you don't go to jail, you could face immigration consequences, consequences for your job, for housing, and it can be devastating for a person, and you don't have the right. It's a
traffic offense, for example.
A traffic offense can be a misdemeanor. A prostitution case doesn't make it a theft case. A case of
Prostitution could be a misdemeanor.
It's a misdemeanor. A theft case involving less than $750.
Sorry, for prostitution, it depends on the amount requested.
Well, a prostitution case is almost always a misdemeanor. If you are soliciting prostitution or offering prostitution services, it becomes a felony. We're not talking about human trafficking cases or when you're running a brothel. It becomes a felony. But for the vast majority of misdemeanors, you do not have the right to a free attorney. You must hire your own lawyer or represent yourself.
Which crimes that we believe to be very serious in our minds are actually minor. Because prostitution is something very serious, but it turns out to be a minor crime. It is a misdemeanor. Which
Other, assault
be a misdemeanor.
It's a misdemeanor, exactly. It is the threat of imminent violence. A Barry, for example, a man hits a woman. The vast majority of the time that is a misdemeanor, which is that you do not have the right to a lawyer if they are not asking you for one.
Threat, I'm going to kill you. That is a crime.
It can also be a lesser crime, which is part of an assault if it's imminent violence, thefts, DUI for driving drunk on the street, a shove, a misdemeanor. A crime, man.
That's what I say. There are a lot of Cubans here. A
spit, a crime, a spit. If you spit on someone else, that's a misdemeanor.
And it doesn't necessarily mean jail time, or yes, it could mean jail time.
No, it doesn't necessarily mean jail time. Yes, but if you
punch someone and knock their teeth out, that
is already a felony because you're causing someone permanent harm.
That's
the difference, such as the extent or the level of injury the
person receives. I tell people that in Cuba, people laugh, but I say, hey, fighting is forbidden.
Correct.
In Cuba, people get into fistfights, but with total calm. The police come, separate them, say, gentlemen, don't get involved. I mean, nobody in Cuba sees that as a crime. Kids go to school, and if a child gets into a fight at school, they're also committing a crime. If they hit each other,
they're committing a crime. And many years ago, they used to put both of them in jail, but now they're trying to handle it more as a matter of rehabilitation and so on.